In this tutorial, we're going to go over sculpting and how you can start sculpting in Blender. So we're going to start with the default cube. You can just open a project and you should have this already opened. And let's go to sculpting layout. And for all of these layouts can be useful, but keep in mind that for all of this, you can actually swap it in here if you want to do different stuff. And you also have your object mode and sculpt mode in here. So depends on what you're doing. You don't have to use these windows, but they're kind of useful where if let's say I go to shading, I don't have to separate windows. I don't have to change to shaders or shader editor, stuff like that. We can just go to our tab. So that's why I'm using sculpt, but we could also be in here and just go to object mode, sculpt mode, and try sculpting. But yeah. So when you go to sculpt mode, basically it will, whatever object we have selected, it will automatically go into sculpt mode for that object. And we have this one object selected. And if you just try to click left click and try to sculpt, you can see that you are already working. And how sculpt works is basically you're just modifying vertices. In some way, you can even retopologize, add vertices, add detail, but you can also just modify. So when you go to sculpt mode, you have a few things. First, on the left, we have our brushes, and there is a bunch of them. Most of them for general sculpting you probably won't even use. There is some specific things in here that are kind of recently added. In some previous versions you only had like maybe 10-15 brushes. Now you have over 30. But most important brushes are the draw brush. You have clay brush, which is this one. You're probably going to use maybe inflate. Crease is not a bad one. And then some things in here like grab or move. Where is that one? Actually, yeah, grab is the same as move, but you have the grab. And maybe snake hook can be interesting. And in general, that's about it. You also have smooth, which you're going to use, but you have shortcut Shift S, so that's not something that you have to. So if I hold Shift, I can just start smoothing my object. So you probably won't even go in here to do this. Okay, so let's start working. So first, our object is a bit too simplified. And there is multiple ways that you can add some detail to your mesh. One is to click Dynamo Topology. And that basically means that we are going to automatically try adding some detail when we start painting, depending on the settings that we have in here. So if I increase this to 24 pixels, start painting, we can see that we now destroyed kind of the lower resolution detail, and now we retopologized into this higher quality, or actually lower quality, since we increased the detail size. So if you want to work with this, I would suggest starting with higher number and then going lower and lower as you work, so you can add more and more detail. You can also do smooth shading, so it looks a bit nicer when you work, especially if we go back to 16. We can see that it kind of looks nicer, especially for organic modeling. If you want something more rigid, you probably wouldn't use the smooth shading. Also, you have your detail. So relative detail basically means to your brush size and detail size. So basically, depending on what brush you have and stuff like that, how zoom in, things will change how much detail you're adding. But if you do constant detail, it will just have one type of detail. So nothing matters. You just have this detail and that's it. So I can zoom out. There is still the same amount of detail. So it depends on basically what you want while you're using this. Now, dynamic topology can make it a bit messy to work with, especially when you will into high resolution, where also performance might drop a bit. And also it can be kind of destructive to every time retopologize while you're working. So if I go to this view and let's say start working on this part, you can see how everything is kind of always retopologizing, always changing. So that might be a bit weird to work with. So let's go to layout and let's delete this cube. Click Shift A and click on the cube again. Now that we have the new cube, let's go to sculpting again. Let's hold Z and go to solid so we can see everything normally again. And one thing that we can do is add a modifier, and there is a, let's find it, multi-resolution. So this way we can basically add some detail while we are, actually let's go to layout. Add some detail while we are sculpting. So actually I need to click on subdivide. So if I do this 2 times and go to sculpt and try to paint, we can see that we now have more detail. But I can also go into lower detail and change that as well. So this way we are kind of working less destructively. We can also see how it optimizes for the viewport. When you start moving around, it goes to lower resolution, so it is easier for you to move around, basically save some performance. So this might not be a bad way to kind of start working with things, because you can always just subdivide and start working on the higher level things. And you can, of course, at any point go to lower level and modify. Maybe for some reason you want this part to be extracted, you can do it in here. And then, of course, since it's subdivided, it will kind of smooth it out, but you have the general idea here, and then you can continue working. So this might be a good idea. Pretty nice to work with instead of working with the dynamic topology, because it can get kind of weird. Of course, now in here we have some problem where if we stretch some things, like even if we have a bunch of detail in here, since the detail is uniform and we stretched one part, now here we have no detail basically. So we would have to increase the sculpt again or subdivide to gain again the detail in here a bit. So this can be a little bit of advantage for the dynamic topology, dyno topology. So because we can easily just add detail in here while leaving whatever detail we had in here. So that is also another thing to keep in mind when working with this. So let's go to layout again and delete our object, and let's go create another cube. And the last thing, last way that you could kind of add more detail is subdivision. And in this way you would just add generally detail and then compile, not compile, but apply that to the object and then work with that. So we can do maybe, let's say 5. Oops, not that. Let's click apply. And now we can see there is a bunch of detail in there. Let's go back to sculpting. Let's go here. And now if we work with the object, actually let's not use snake hook. Now if we work with the object, it is kind of smooth. We can work with it. There is a bunch of detail, but we have the same problem again, where if we stretch one side a bit too much, let's see, did I pick the right one? Yes. If we stretch a side too much, we can get this where we still lose detail. So we would have to go again, subdivide, add even more detail, and then we would start being able to do work again. But if we use this, and let's put it to 8 pixels, we can start working here and have the detail, but then our topology is completely screwed. For the other subdivision or multi-resolution, so for this multi-resolution and then subdivision surface, the advantage is that you have a really nice topology that you can create lower or higher quality without having to do some retopology later. So right now we are destroying whatever topology we had before that was nice squares, and now we are going to have to do some retopology later. Retopology basically means we're going to have to create a lower polygon mesh from this, since this topology is just made to have a bunch of detail, not to be created in a good way. So that's kind of the pros and cons of different ways to basically sculpt. It all depends. If you have a really good PC, I think you can just subdivide it 10 times and don't care about it. You can have like 10 million polygons, but if you don't have a really good PC, it will be really laggy and won't work well. And for multi-resolution similar, while with dynamic retopology you can kind of add some more detail in some places, but then you have to keep in mind later you probably have to retopologize, because for lower polygon meshes, subdividing it with multi-resolution and subdivision, you can way more easily just unsubdivide and decrease the resolution, and it works nicely. In this, with the dynamic topology, you can just do that. So yeah. Now that we have kind of that figured out, let's just go quickly through some settings so you kind of have general idea how you can actually start sculpting. So we have different brushes that do different things. You can usually just click on them and test them out and see what they do. So inflate does what it kind of says, it just inflates. Of course, increasing the strength might make it more obvious what it does. Crease adds creases, so if I go to this little part, I can just add a little crease if I want. This is good for cloth, stuff like that. You have flatten, so you can just flatten parts of the mesh. Now it's really hard to flatten a cube. Also, we have dynamic topology enabled, so it might not work good with this, but if you try to flatten, we can see how we are flattening slowly a part of the mesh. And there is few other. The pose is not a bad one, because if you have a character, you can kind of start posing the character, but you probably won't use it that much. You have layer. You can just add a layer on top. We have the thumb. We had it in here, so you can kind of just push or move things. Like if you want. It's also good for maybe cloth or something where you can just push things. So these are kind of few of them that are interesting. Also, if you have a brush, to do something opposite than the brush does, you can hold control, and now we are instead of inflating, we are deflating whatever we have selected. So you can see how it bringing it in and squeezing it. So when it starts squeezing it, they go to each other's sides, so it kind of breaks a bit, but you can hold shift and smooth it out. And the same way with our normal brush. Normally we are just painting over, but if you hold control, we are doing the opposite. You can of course click in here to change the direction. So if I click this and without holding control, we can just do the opposite thing. And if I hold control, it's gonna do the normal thing. So it depends on what you have selected here. For a lot of brushes, you have that. For this specific, maybe you don't, but for a bunch of them, you do have to just invert whatever you are doing. Then you have your radius, strength. They are pretty self-explanatory. To increase the brush strength, how much strength you are applying. And then you have a bunch of other options. Let's see if we have anything that is really useful here. You have strength. We have hardness, which can help with the edges. So if I smooth this down, we can see how edges are really rough. And each brush is kind of separate, but if I decrease the hardness, everything is kind of smooth. The brushes work with each other. With each like brush paint, it works smoothly. That is one good one. You can also use textures. I don't have any texture right now, but you can also use textures, so it's not just this blend smooth. You can use maybe if you have a texture of let's say we have a texture of question mark. I could just paint and it will kind of look in that shape. So you can also use textures for this. You can change strokes, spacing, so how frequent the strokes are applied. So I'm going around, since we have really big spacing, it will make so you can kind of create blobs. You can also click right click and reset the default value. So if you just want to bring everything back. You also have stabilized stroke, so this is basically used for maybe tablets, or if you want smoother work, so you don't have like jitteriness of using a mouse. You can use stabilized stroke. Fall off is basically the smoothness, so if I select something like this, it's gonna be really rough, almost representing like a hardness that we had before. But I can also use some weird shapes where the curve is different. I can also, of course, customize the curve. So this basically means that in the middle, it's gonna be way stronger than from the sides. But if you do something like this, then the middle is gonna be middle and the sides are gonna be strong, and then there is a little fall off at the end. But we don't kind of see do too much of that. So the fall off is also important, and also we have symmetry. Now this object is not symmetric, but if you had symmetry, we should use mirror, and then let's see if this works. We can kind of use mirror in here, but it's gonna use like the world space to kind of tell you what's mirroring. And for symmetric objects, you would want this from the beginning. You don't want to make any brush stroke that is not mirrored. And I think that's about it. With kind of this basic knowledge, you should be able to start sculpting. But of course, this skill will come after some practice, where you kind of figure out the best way to sculpt whatever you want to sculpt.